For 17 years, Judge Evelyn Hayes thought nothing in her courtroom could surprise her, until the day she recognized the defendant as a fugitive from a 30-year-old cold case. Judge Evelyn Hayes, a woman defined by her meticulous attention to precedent and her unwavering, almost severe judicial temperament. At 58, her features were sharp, framed by a precise silver bob, and her judicial robe settled across her shoulders like armor. She sat on the elevated bench, the symbol of impartial justice, running her day as she ran her life, with relentless, quantifiable order. The day's docket was tedious, a long list of minor violations designed to test the patience of even the most seasoned judge: petty theft, low-level drug possession, repeat traffic offenders. The banality of modern crime often weighed on Evelyn, an unending cycle of minor offenses that rarely hinted at the true, destructive evils that had once been possible. It was the memory of one such evil, now 30 years old, that truly shaped her, a phantom case known officially only as the Riverside Incident. It was the unsolved murder of her younger sister, Clara. Evelyn, then 28 and a fresh prosecutor, had watched that case. Her life collapse into an abyss of procedural errors and dead ends. The killer, a man briefly identified only by a shaky witness sketch, had vanished entirely, leaving no trace but the devastation of her family and the absolute, unshakable certainty in Evelyn's gut that she had looked directly into the face of pure, calculated malice. The case had driven her career, hardening her exterior into the stone of the bench itself, forcing her to seek justice in the present because she could not achieve it in the past. She glanced down at the case file currently on deck. State versus Arthur Simmons. Charge: possession of stolen property, an improperly registered vintage motorcycle. A typical Tuesday grind. The proceedings were routine, the defense counsel was lackluster, and the prosecutor was eager to move to the next file. Evelyn adjusted her collar, preparing to offer a boilerplate admonishment and set a modest bail. She was ready to move on. She was ready for anything, except for the past to walk through the swinging gate of her courtroom. The bailiff called the name, and the defendant was brought forward. Arthur Simmons. He was a man in his late 50s, roughly Evelyn's age, which meant he would have been in his mid-20s in 1993. He was slight in stature, perhaps 5'7", with a wiry build of someone who had done physical labor for decades. His face was unremarkable, the kind that blended instantly into a crowd. A weathered complexion, thinning, salt and pepper hair, and a tired, compliant expression that signaled either sincere regret or practiced indifference. He wore an inexpensive, clean jacket and appeared visibly nervous, standard for a first-time felony offender. But as the man was guided to stand before the bench, Evelyn's internal composure, the professional wall she had built around her memory, cracked. It was not a grand resemblance or a sudden, dramatic facial match. It was something smaller, something that defied the 30 years of aging, weight gain, and shifting fashion. It was an anomaly. Evelyn felt a physical jolt, a cold shock that traveled from her spine to her fingertips. She gripped the edge of the bench, forcing her breathing to remain even, focusing intensely on the man's hands as he rested them on the defense table. The man's eyes were a faded, unremarkable brown. His nose was ordinary. His demeanor was submissive. But the memory was triggered by something microscopic, something she had only seen in the deepest trauma files of the Riverside Incident. It was the way the man stood. Specifically, the slight, almost imperceptible list to his left side when he placed his weight down, a result perhaps of an old, poorly healed injury to the hip or leg. The old witness sketch from 1993, drawn by a woman who had seen the suspect flee the scene for less than 10 seconds, had included a single, bizarre marginal note. Walks like he's dragging a shadow, favors the left. The sketch artist had struggled to capture the face, but had obsessively documented the perpetrator's gait. Evelyn remembered the note, the only unique behavioral detail they had ever possessed. 30 years ago, that detail was dismissed as the product of the witness's imagination or temporary injury. Now, she was staring at the persistent, residual evidence of that exact, decades-old physical characteristic. The sight brought the phantom scent of old blood and river water back to her memory with sickening clarity. She was looking at the ghost of her sister's killer. Evelyn's courtroom persona did not waver. Her voice remained cool, authoritative, demanding the full respect of the court, but beneath the measured tone, a war raged. She forced herself to listen to the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Reynolds, summarizing the details of the stolen motorcycle charge. Arthur Simmons, a handyman from the South Side, was caught trying to register the vintage vehicle using altered paperwork. A mundane crime, easily solved, easily dismissed. But Evelyn's attention was fixed elsewhere, performing a terrifying internal cross-reference with a memory vault that had been sealed for 3 decades. Clara, her sister, had been 23. She was vibrant, loud, and full of the chaotic optimism Evelyn had long since purged from her own personality. Clara was found near the Riverside Park access trail, a single, deep incision marking the act. The case was famously messy. No fingerprints, a clean getaway, and the single, useless piece of physical evidence, a small dark enamel pin depicting a hawk, found clutched in Clara's hand, a pin that no one recognized. The primary suspect, a vagrant seen in the area, was cleared. The physical descriptions were vague. Medium height, dark jacket, hat. The case died on the desk of a tired detective, marked by the chief as an unfortunate tragedy with no verifiable leads. Evelyn, then a tenacious young lawyer, had been granted limited access to the final file, spending weeks immersed in the cold data, knowing the police had given up too quickly. It was during those weeks that she found the marginalia. The full witness statement from Mrs. Periwinkle, who saw the man running across the park lawn at dusk. The detective had focused on the face description, but Mrs. Periwinkle's note about the walk was in the appendix. He had a nervous energy, but the left side of his body seemed reluctant, like he was dragging a heavy coat. Now, Arthur Simmons, standing 5 feet away, waiting for her judgment on a stolen motorcycle, shifted his weight. The movement was a perfect physical echo of that 30-year-old detail. Evelyn forced her gaze back to his face, searching for a second confirmation. The aging process had been kind, smoothing out the sharper edges of youth, but it revealed something else. She looked closely at the man's hairline, just above his left ear, where the hair was sparse. There was a faint, pinkish line, almost hidden in the salt and pepper stubble, a scar. Clara had been an amateur competitive fencer in college. During the chaotic scene at the Riverside, investigators hypothesized the perpetrator might have sustained a minor wound, possibly from a quick, defensive swipe of Clara's own keys. It was a theory that went nowhere. The initial police report mentioned a witness saw a man wiping his head shortly after the crime, but the lead was never followed up. The scar was tiny, the relic of a wound 3 decades old, but it was there precisely where a panic cut could have landed. The specific gait, the faint scar, the matching age profile, the coincidence was not possible. The absolute, unshakable certainty solidified into granite in Evelyn's mind. Arthur Simmons was the man who had killed her sister. The moment she realized the defendant was a ghost from her past, the courtroom transformed from a stage of justice into a cage that Arthur Simmons must not be allowed to leave. Evelyn, however, could not simply accuse him. She was bound by the rigid protocols of the judiciary. She was a judge, not a detective. Any rash move, any show of personal emotion, would taint the proceedings and grant Simmons a perfect legal escape. She had to buy time. She had to verify. Evelyn leaned forward, placing her elbows on the bench, a posture that signaled gravitas, though she was performing the most desperate act of her career. Mr. Reynolds, her voice was low and resonant. I have reviewed the preliminary complaint in State versus Simmons. While the charge itself is clear, I find the chain of custody report for the recovered property, the 1958 Triumph motorcycle, to be insufficiently detailed regarding the method of initial identification. Furthermore, the defense raises a legitimate question regarding the probable cause for the initial traffic stop, which appears to hinge solely on the improper display of the VIN. The prosecutor, Reynolds, blinked. "Your Honor, the initial stop was perfectly valid. The plates were provisional. The paperwork was forged. It's a standard plea, a 30-day suspension, and a fine." "The court must be satisfied," Evelyn stated, allowing a flicker of stern authority to enter her voice. This case raises ancillary issues regarding potential interstate transportation of fraudulent documents, issues which may exceed the jurisdiction of this court and may require the involvement of federal agencies, thus potentially declaring a mistrial for overcharging at the state level. The legal jargon, meticulously deployed, had its intended effect. The prosecutor was instantly thrown off balance. The defense attorney, a younger man named Kress, suddenly saw a pathway to leverage and nodded eagerly. Therefore, Evelyn declared, her gaze briefly sweeping past Arthur Simmons. In the interest of procedural thoroughness and to prevent a potential double jeopardy claim, the court requires a full, detailed review of the defendant's criminal history, including any and all records involving property disputes, prior arrests, and all Social Security and driver's license history, spanning the past 3 decades. I want this information compiled and presented to me in chambers by 4 p.m. today. This hearing is formally adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. She slammed her gavel once, a sound of finality that disguised the chaotic internal energy it released. The room stirred into action. As the bailiff escorted Arthur Simmons back through the gate, Evelyn made a subtle movement. She activated the microphone on her bench phone, muting the voice channel, and pressed the number for Captain Markovich, her single trusted contact in the old, retired homicide division. The message was whispered into the silent circuit. "Markovich, code 4 to 1993. I need the full physical file on the Riverside Incident, specifically the forensic photos of the crime scene and the enamel pin. Delivered to my chambers in 1 hour. No questions, no paperwork, no witnesses." Evelyn retreated to her chambers, a sanctuary of leather-bound law books and quiet professionalism. She peeled off the heavy robe, feeling the release of the immense tension she had held for 45 minutes. She was no longer Judge Hayes. She was Evelyn, the sister, resurrected and terrifyingly focused. She didn't touch her coffee or her lunch. She waited, pacing the plush carpet, her mind running a terrifying simulation of the next steps. If she called the current police department and claimed a suspect had walked into her courtroom based on a 30-year-old gait and a tiny scar, they would dismiss her as an emotionally compromised judge and the suspect would walk free. She needed the physical, archive proof. Precisely 60 minutes later, Captain Markovich, a gruff, silver-haired man who owed Evelyn a professional debt she never intended to collect, appeared at her private side door. He carried a heavy, moldering box sealed with decades-old evidence tape. "I pulled it from the deep archive, Judge," Markovich murmured, his voice heavy with the recognition of the case that had shattered her life. "File 93R. Everything is here. It hasn't been touched in 20 years." Evelyn thanked him with a curt nod, closed the door, and broke the seal. The room instantly filled with the scent of old paper and dust, the smell of time standing still. She ignored the witness reports and the initial police sketch. She went straight for the photographic evidence and the inventory bag. She found the photographs of the crime scene, faded and grainy, showing the exact area of the attack near the riverbank. Then she pulled out the sealed, labeled evidence bag containing the single, unique piece of physical evidence, the enamel hawk pin. It was smaller than she remembered, dark brass with faded blue and white enamel wings. It was a mass-produced item, the kind found in souvenir shops 30 years ago, but it had never been linked to any known store in Havenwood. Evelyn turned her attention back to the present. She retrieved her personal cell phone, the one unconnected to the court system, and pulled up the booking photos of Arthur Simmons. She stared intently at the full-body mugshot, examining the way the man held himself, the subtle, enduring list to the left side that mirrored the old note in the file. She focused on the scar above his left ear, now clearly visible under the harsh lighting of the booking room. It was all circumstantial, powerful in its cumulative effect, but not enough for a murder charge. Then, she remembered the motorcycle charge. Possession of stolen property. Arthur Simmons claimed he bought the bike from a man named Dale in a cash transaction. Evelyn's training as a prosecutor kicked in. Every criminal leaves a secondary signature, an ego-driven detail. She pulled out a magnifying glass and began examining the enamel pin. Markovich had told her once that the pin was slightly damaged, a minuscule scratch in the dark blue enamel near the hawk's head. Evelyn looked at the pin under the harsh desk lamp. The scratch was not random. It was a tiny, jagged mark, almost invisible to the naked eye. She held her breath and then focused the magnifying glass on the pin. The scratch was not merely a scratch. It was the residual mark of a letter, a partially scraped away R. She looked back at the stolen motorcycle paperwork. The forged documents claimed the bike had been last registered in 1990 in Riverside, the neighboring county, before allegedly being sold in a private sale. The tiny, scratched are on the pin. The murder at Riverside Park. The bike allegedly registered in Riverside County. And a man named Arthur Simmons, who walked with the signature limp of the killer. The coincidence dissolved into the inevitable. The pin was his, dropped during the struggle. He had attempted to scratch off the first letter of his home county, a detail only a guilty man would care about before fleeing. She had him, but she had to hold him. The police report confirming Arthur Simmons's full criminal history arrived electronically at 4:15 p.m., brought directly by a flustered Reynolds. The file was predictably clean of any major felonies, just a motorcycle charge and a few minor, decades-old traffic citations. A perfect ghost, a man who had successfully hidden in plain sight, committing only small, manageable crimes to avoid scrutiny. However, the file did contain one critical, modern detail that Evelyn had engineered the adjournment to procure: a fresh set of fingerprints taken during his arrest for the motorcycle charge. Evelyn knew the original 1993 Riverside Incident file contained one partial, unidentifiable palm print lifted from the interior of Claire's car door handle. A print so smudged the technology of the time rendered it useless for matching. But modern forensic databases, she knew, could now extrapolate entire profiles from partial prints. She called Captain Markovich one last time, bypassing all standard procedure. "Captain, I need you to take the booking print car of Arthur Simmons and run an immediate, direct compare against the partial palm print from File 93R. Use the State Bureau's latest algorithm. You have 2 hours. If anyone asks, you're conducting a cold case review for a jurisdictional transfer." Markovich understood the gravity. This was the moment of truth. Evelyn sat down at her desk, her hands folded, looking completely calm. The silence in the chambers was profound, broken only by the clock ticking down the last minutes before the bail review the next morning. If the print match failed, Simmons would walk out tomorrow morning on $1,000 bail and vanish forever. At 6:02 p.m., her private line rang. It was Markovich. His voice was raw, devoid of professional composure. "Judge," he said simply, "we have a 100% positive identification. The partial print from a 1993 Riverside Incident belongs to Arthur Simmons. The unique skin ridges matched 8 points of interest on the new booking card. He did it, Evelyn. He's the one." The confirmation was instantaneous, terrifying, and ultimately absolute. Evelyn closed her eyes. 30 years of waiting, of agonizing, of seeking justice that was denied had led to this moment. The murder of her sister was now solved, not by a detective agency, but by a simple traffic stop and a judge's unshakable memory. The next morning, Courtroom 301 felt charged with an electricity Evelyn Hayes alone could perceive. The bullpen was full of nervous local detectives, now fully briefed and ready to execute a murder warrant. But they needed the legal window to secure the arrest without compromising the evidence. Arthur Simmons was brought before the bench for his adjourned bail review. He seemed more confident than yesterday, encouraged by his attorney's successful stalling maneuver. He was ready to pay his fine and disappear into the anonymity of the South Side. Evelyn looked down at him, her face a mask of judicial neutrality, but her blue eyes held the cold, hard brilliance of diamond. Mr. Simmons, she began, her voice ringing clear through the silent courtroom. The court has reviewed your history and the preliminary findings concerning the circumstances of your arrest. Kress, the defense attorney, stood up, ready to argue the low bail. Your Honor, this is a clear case for release on own recognizance. My client is a handyman with deep community ties, no flight risk, and no. Evelyn cut him off, her gavel hand raised. The court notes that Mr. Simmons, in the process of attempting to register a vehicle with forged documents, provided the state with a fraudulent social security number and a false address, utilizing an alias that was not on file with the DMV. The subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of identity concealment consistent with an individual attempting to actively evade law enforcement for a prolonged period. She leaned forward, her voice hardening to steel. This man's entire life appears to be built on an intentional foundation of lies. The crime is not merely possession of stolen property. It is an endemic disregard for the laws and civil institutions of this state. Given the extensive history of calculated deception uncovered in the verification process, this court finds Arthur Simmons to be an extreme and immediate flight risk. She looked directly into Arthur Simmons's faded brown eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of pure, panicked comprehension. He realized he was trapped. The camouflage of 30 years was gone. Evelyn's gavel dropped with a decisive, final sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. Bail is hereby set at $5 million, cash only. The defendant is remanded into custody until the funds are posted. Mr. Simmons, you will remain where you belong. As the bailiff approached to escort the stunned, terrified man out, Arthur Simmons finally looked up at the judge. His eyes were no longer indifferent. They were desperate and burning with pure, unmasked hatred. It was the same look of cold malice that Evelyn Hayes had carried in her memory for 3 decades. The gates swung shut. The courtroom was silent. Judge Evelyn Hayes sat alone on the bench. The weight of the robe suddenly lighter, and the decades-old score finally settled. This was Trace Crime Files. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and justice is never as simple as it seems.